All right, happy birthday, Chris. I wouldn't normally do this, but I thought since you're having kind of a big year, getting engaged and uh, doing a lot of awesome stuff out there in California, and now it's your birthday, I thought for your birthday, I would tell all of your friends, old and new, the secret origin story of how Chris Baker became the C-Bake that we all know and love. So, uh, I met Chris as a freshman, when I was a freshman at the University of Tennessee, and Brad Mallison and I were rooming together in Reese Hall, and randomly Chris was assigned to be our suite mate. So he didn't live in our room, but he lived in the adjacent room, and we all shared a bathroom. And Chris's roommate was a guy named Sam. I don't remember Sam's last name, and Sam wasn't around much. I don't remember too much about him. He was always gone, but Chris was around, and the main thing I think that we knew about Chris at that time was that he was really polite and he was quiet. He was a pretty quiet guy. And he was clean in the bathroom. He was definitely a good person to share a shower and a toilet with at the time, which became relevant at the end of the year when Brad and I were looking for new roommates. We were going to move into an apartment with another friend of ours, and we needed a fourth. And we thought, who really would be a good person to live with is Chris Baker, because he's a nice guy. We all like him. He's definitely never does anything too upsetting, and he keeps things tidy, which is a pretty good quality in a roommate. And so Brad and I and our friend Chris Holloman, who everybody called Chalo because that was his randomly assigned email address from the university. So Brad and I and Chalo asked Chris if he wanted to move in with us to an apartment at Andy Holt apartment tower, which is like some campus apartment dormitory, and he said yes. So great, sophomore year was coming up. We had our roommate, and that gave us a chance to really get to know the guy. Chris was a pretty quiet roommate, kind of in the same way that he was a quiet suite mate. He just sort of did his own thing, and he was pretty chill. He didn't drink a lot, if any. I don't remember him really ever doing anything too crazy. But one day, Brad and Chalo and I were sitting around at lunch, and Chalo was studying, I think at the time, some sort of experimental psychology. And he was telling us how people, if you put expectations on them and gave them suggestions about what kind of person they were, they would, for whatever reason, start acting in accord with the expectations and the suggestions. And so, I don't remember who said it, but somebody said, well, what if we started calling... What if we took Chris Baker and we gave him like a crazy party person nickname? What if we started calling him C-Bake? Like, what's up, C-Bake? Like, C-Bakey Bake? Like, C-Bake? What if we started calling him C-Bake? Do you think that he would start to act different? Like, kind of like a crazy party person? And everybody said, well, I don't know, but it's an awesome nickname anyway, so why don't we just try it and see what happens? And so I don't think anybody talked to Chris about this, but we just started calling him C-Bake in sort of a way that suggested that we expected him to be kind of more crazy, like outgoing. And I have to say that it worked swimmingly. We used to go, Brad and Chalo and I were all part of the University of Tennessee sailing team, and Brad also played volleyball, and so we would take all these sailing people and all these volleyball people, and we have these like big parties. And C-Bake sailed with us, sort of eventually. He kind of joined up and became a part of that crew, but we would take him over to these parties at the volleyball team's house over at 710 12th Street in Knoxville, over in the fort. And C-Bake, I remember, not really like drinking too much or getting too out of control, but these were parties that were kind of, they're like pretty ridiculous places to be. These volleyball guys had just stacks of old kegs sitting around. They would take them out in the street and do keg bowling, and they had boxing gloves, and people were, having a big time, and there was always something wild going on. Lots of keg tossing competitions. You just sort of really, there was a lot of ridiculousness. After we started calling Chris C-Bake, we noticed that he would, he sort of gradually morphed a little bit. I want to say he started like using some hair product, so all of a sudden he had kind of a crazy thing going on with his hair when we would go out, and he would wear like sort of maybe like a little bit hipper shirt, And then one night he was at the volleyball house, and they would have these giant Gatorade jugs that they would just fill with grain alcohol and throw some, I don't know if it was Gatorade or Kool-Aid powder or something like that in there, but at any rate, it was pink, and it was for people who didn't like beer too much. But Seabake found the giant jug of like grain alcohol and Gatorade powder, and man, he came out of his shell. It was like, I mean, I just remember a number of evenings him walking back from that place, just like dripping sweat and just wild and crazy. And so the nickname thing worked, and that's how he got the nickname. It was kind of a weird way to see if we could kind of coax him into becoming this party monster. But now he never really got that nuts. I mean, Seabake was always Seabake. He was always kind of real chill. But I do remember that Chalo, his brother Dave, and I and Chris Seabake would take these trips out Kingston Pike to McKay's used bookstore. And I mean, I think most of the time we were going because I was studying political science or journalism, like probably those two things, and I would have to write these papers, and so I would need sources to cite because I can't just, you have to have a source. And I hated going to the library, so I would go to McKay's used books, and for 15, 25 cents a piece, I would just buy old political science and American history textbooks, and then I would have them sitting on my shelf, so I never had to leave my room to write one of these papers. We'd go out there, and Chris Holloman was studying, something that didn't require him to drive out and buy 25-cent books, but they also had like a used record counter, and so he and his brother Dave would buy, I don't know, for 10 cents a piece, old scratched versions of like a Marcy Playground CD or something, like really terrible like that, but the wrong song was scratched, and so they could still use it because they just wanted the one single that was on the radio, and so they would buy stacks of those. But Seabake he would go straight over to the used game counter, and they had this big glass counter, and it just had all these old 8-bit Nintendo games, and there was all these Super Nintendo games in there, and I think probably PlayStation 1 might have been around at that time, but for sure the 8-bit Nintendo games were 50 cents a piece or something. And so Seabake would just say, okay, well, give me all of them. I want all of the 8-bit Nintendo games. I said, well, what are you doing with those? He just, but so anyway, he shows up back at the dorm room, and he's got this old gray Nintendo, and he plugs the cartridge in, he sits down and has a beer and starts playing the games, and he spends a lot of time playing 8-bit Nintendo, I want to say, through the end of our junior year and our senior year. And finally somebody asked him, what's the deal? And he'd say, oh, well, I sit down, I grab a beer, and I just play each of these games until I beat them, and then there's this website called allgameguide.com. And so when I beat the game, I just get on it and I write a real quick review of the game, and if I write sort of a short review, they pay me $10, and if I write a longer review, they pay me $25, and it worked out that was how Chris was making his beer money, by buying these 50-cent game cartridges from McKay's and sitting around, having a beer and playing Nintendo, and that was really what he did during college. Because I think, if I remember correctly, he was studying advertising, and he never had any actual schoolwork to do. Maybe that's a little unfair. I do remember him one time he made something on poster board, but I mean, other than that, it was like a lot of Nintendo, and then some hair product, and then drinking Punch Punch, and that was pretty much his deal. Well, getting toward the end of his senior year, Brad and my junior year, I remember we got a phone call at the dorm room, and so it was All Game Guide calling Chris, and they said, we see we're paying you a lot of money for video game reviews. Wouldn't it be a lot easier for everybody if we just gave you a job on site? And now this may not be 100% how it actually happened, but it's how I remember it happening. But so All Game Guide basically says, why don't we just hire you, and Seabake can come work for us, and we'll just pay you a salary instead of paying you all this ridiculous money to write review after review after review. And so I think I don't recall specifically, but I think he took that job. But it was short-lived. It may have moved him to Chicago, but I'm not sure. At any rate, he definitely wasn't there long, because his popularity was, for whatever reason, on the rise. And then the official U.S. PlayStation magazine hired him away from there, and that certainly was in Chicago. And then they moved him out to San Francisco, and he got hired away from there by, I believe, Lucasfilm. and then Marvel Comics. So he has worked a sort of trifecta of nerd dream jobs, and I mostly attribute that to his outgoing personality that I think probably came from when we gave him the nickname Seabake. So that is, to the best of my recollection, how Chris Baker, the quiet, demure advertising student, became Seabake, everyone's favorite video game and pop culture personality. And anyway, I hope you have a happy birthday, and hope to see you soon.